Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Amelie Maran Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about budgeting when you travel as well as when you move abroad. I want to talk about budgeting today because this week has been conversations all about money and putting deposit down on flats and talking about rent, bills and how that's going to kind of look in my life. And I was looking at a lot of TikToks and people are just constantly asking about budget. That's the one thing that everybody doesn't know where to start, essentially. And it's such a subjective thing because obviously it depends where you're moving to. It depends on how long you're going to be in a certain area for. So I'm kind of wanting to keep it so that it applies to everybody. And I can obviously only go off my experience, but I'm trying to put what everybody has told me and stories from other people traveling, other people that have moved to Australia, just put all of their knowledge into this one episode and try and give you guys the best advice for budgeting when traveling or moving abroad. So let's get into it. I feel like we need to start at the very beginning. So before you've even begun traveling or before you're thinking of moving wherever, the biggest question is always going to be, how do I budget for this trip? I'm just going to take you through what I think are the biggest topics when asked about budgeting. And so the first one is obviously, what is the cost of where you're going to be moving to or the specific areas where you're going to be traveling to? That feels like a very broad question and something that I was definitely conscious of before we left the UK. But what I found is your biggest research tool is actually going to be places like Facebook groups or even TikTok. TikTok was an absolute lifesaver when we were traveling. You just type in the area you're going to and you can watch so many videos of people talking about their experiences, the ups and the downs, and what are the best parts about traveling or moving somewhere, and obviously the bad parts. So to research how much it's going to cost for your trip, it sounds obvious, but research. And like I say, the best places that I found were TikTok and Facebook. Also looking at people's blogs, it was their personal experiences, and I felt like it felt a bit more authentic maybe than just on Google. I think also when you're from the UK, there is a slight advantage, for example, if you want to move to Australia, because a lot of young people do make the move. A lot of people do a year away. And I was able to ask around, ask friends, ask family friends, their experiences. And so honestly, word of mouth is probably also your best bet, just speaking to people. And sometimes people will do the research for you and get back to you. You never know. So just talking about maybe what you're planning on doing and just getting as much knowledge as you can. And before you go, you obviously want to be thinking about how much money you're actually going to have when you arrive. I have done this research and I did a lot of it before coming to Australia, and it seems to be that 3 to 6 months worth of rent and bills and food is kind of the ideal. But I will be honest, I had, I think, £100 to my name coming to Australia. I did not prep for that kind of budget. We'd also obviously been traveling for quite a long time before moving here. So it wasn't just a straight move from the UK, which I feel would be a lot easier. Also, the pound kind of doubles into Australian dollars, which we'll talk about a bit later. So I feel like that would have been a bit more comfortable, maybe made me feel a bit more secure, but I turned up with nothing and I'm okay. Another thing that I don't think a lot of people think about before you've even left to go traveling or to move abroad is all the little hidden costs that you don't think about. Things like your Ubers from the airport to your accommodation, or getting a snack here and there when you've been traveling for 20 hours and haven't slept. Just little things that you might want or need in the moment, but you haven't planned because you're budgeting for the big purchases and the rent and the hotels and the hostels and things. So definitely having a bit more than your 3 to 6 month budget if that's what you decide to go with. Obviously, we turned up in Australia, didn't have lots of money. So for us, it was kind of had to budget on things like the snacks, but Ubers to our hotel from the airport was you had to pay it. There wasn't really another option for us. I think in Latin America, Uber was £1 for a 20-minute trip. I mean, it was so cheap. And then you come to Melbourne and obviously it's back to your kind of normal prices where it's quite a bit more expensive. I would say Uber over here is still pretty cheap, but comparing it to what you've been experiencing for 6 months, it was a big change. But there are obviously other hidden costs, things like your visa. The working holiday visa is typically, I think, £360 to £390, £360 to £390. So you need to obviously budget that and factor that into it. Also things like vaccinations. I know that for Asia you have to get quite a few vaccinations. I don't know the specific ones, but obviously if you just research it, I'm sure it's easy enough, you can find them. And some you'll get on the NHS, some you might have to pay for. We were quite lucky that we didn't have too many vaccinations that we had to get. We only had one that was mandatory for Colombia, which was the yellow fever vaccination. They told us we wouldn't be allowed into the country if we didn't have it. And we were also told we wouldn't be allowed into Australia if we'd come from Latin America to Australia without it. So we just thought, might as well. We did have to pay for that one. It was £65 just from a travel clinic at home. But all the other vaccinations like Hep A, Hep B, typhoid, you can get on the NHS and that's all fine. But just these little things that you don't think about, I would definitely do your research beforehand and see how much this is all going to cost you. I know for people going to Asia, it can add up quite quickly because there's some vaccinations that you do have to pay for and some that are mandatory. That's just from speaking to friends that have been to Asia and obviously have needed to get these vaccinations. So just doing your research on things like that will definitely help, and you can just put it into your budget for traveling. How to not overspend. I'm still trying to figure that out. I've written down stick to a budget, and I will be honest, it's actually not until I've come to Australia that I've begun a budget, and obviously you have to become quite realistic. Like I say, I arrived with barely any money, so I had to set realistic goals for myself and be very strict on what I was spending or what I am spending my money on. Also, I do say this, but I have just spent quite a bit of money at the charity shop getting some new clothes. So, take everything I'm saying with a pinch of salt. But when you're actually traveling or backpacking, setting a daily budget, I find really helped us in the beginning. I can't say we stuck to that, but daily budgets was something I had researched beforehand. And if I can find the link of the blog that I used to kind of understand a daily budget, I will definitely put it in the description. But I was really conscious of a daily budget at the beginning, because at the beginning, I feel like you have so much money that you're not going to care about it, and you're not going to be conscious of how much you're spending because it looks like you have a lot of money. But when that money has to last you a certain amount of time, which in our case was 6 months plus a year, you actually don't have that much money, you'll soon come to realize. But daily budgeting definitely helped in the beginning. Like I say, we kind of ended up not sticking to it. We weren't completely overspending or anything, but we just became less and less conscious of it, if I'm completely honest. Bringing cash was also a really good way to budget because, like I said, we kind of ended up leaving the daily budget. But at the beginning, our first month of traveling, we only had the cash that we'd brought with us from the UK. And so we would say, right, we're only going to take out X amount with us today, and that's our spending limit. And it makes you keep track of it a lot more. I will also put names of the apps that I used to help keep track of my daily budget, because that was really helpful for the first few months of traveling. It really put in perspective what I was spending my money on, and also give me an idea of the daily budget that what I'd seen online compared to what I was spending, if that makes sense. Saving money on accommodation, I would say, is using hostels to your best ability, staying in hostels as much as you can if you're backpacking. And this applies to anywhere, whether you're in Latin America, whether you're in Asia, whether you're in Australia. I know that obviously the prices of hostels are going to differ. It's going to be a lot cheaper in Latin America, and I think even cheaper in Asia. Australia, I have heard the hostels are quite expensive and maybe not the nicest, maybe for what you're paying. But hostels are typically going to be cheaper. I think it really depends on your standards maybe and what you're willing to spend your money on. Like I've previously said in episodes before, we stayed in a hotel when we first arrived in Australia. We really wanted the comfort because of how long our flight was and just getting used to the jet lag. We had 16-hour jet lag, which was not fun to recover from at all. So for us, we ended up paying, I think, slightly more a night than a hostel would have been for a really nice hotel. So you just kind of have to do your research on things like that. I know that Hostelworld was quite helpful when we were traveling, and honestly, booking.com was amazing. You level up on booking.com and you can be different levels, meaning you get different discounts on your accommodation that you're booking. So we really utilized that and got so much money off hostels and apartments that we stayed in during traveling, which then helped us save money when we got to the hotel in Melbourne. I've also heard that people do house sitting, which I've not personally explored, but a lot of people tell me that house sitting or pet sitting for people is a really cheap way to get around Australia. So you can house sit for somebody for 2 weeks, and in exchange, they don't necessarily pay you, or you don't have to pay for the accommodation. They're kind of paying you with giving you somewhere to sleep, and you are obviously looking after their dog or their cat. I think that would be quite an effective way as well if you're traveling up and down different areas of Australia, and you're quite flexible with where you can be. I think that would be quite a good way to save money. And like I've said so many times, Facebook is your best bet. Flatmate finders. I feel like you get a more direct relationship with people when you're looking for somewhere to actually live. And it just means that you can communicate a lot more easily. You don't have to go through an estate agent. You can just kind of have that direct relationship with someone and talk about the accommodation that either they're looking for someone to fill or you're looking for somewhere to stay. You will not overspend, I don't think, if you cook for yourself whilst you're traveling. I would like to say that we didn't overspend because we ended up buying a lot of food and cooking for ourselves towards the end of the trip, maybe, where it became slightly more expensive. But that really depends on what country you're in, because, for example, eating out in Mexico was quite cheap, but eating out in Argentina was actually very expensive. Somewhere like Argentina, their exchange rate fluctuates so much. So sometimes it would be really cheap to buy food from the shops, and sometimes it would be really, really expensive. Keeping an eye on those exchange rates for buying groceries, I think, is a really, really good tip, because you are technically saving money. It's a lot to go out for every meal. And also, obviously, by cooking for yourself, you can make whatever you want. You'll also definitely save money if you buy street food. It was very, very cheap for us to buy from street food carts or any kind of market stands, but I will say cautiously that sometimes they are not the best option because you can get quite ill from some of the food. I had food poisoning twice, I think, from 2 different countries, and they're stories for another time because it was a whole thing. But it's not fun when you get ill when you're traveling, and it's not fun to get food poisoning, so avoiding it at all costs. Sometimes you can't, and sometimes it's just gonna happen, but yeah, be mindful of the street food and definitely check and trust your gut if you think it's okay to eat, but it will always be cheaper. So if you're looking for the cheaper option, definitely just buy street food if you don't want to cook. For the actual moving part, so if you're looking to move to a different country, for example, Australia, budgeting monthly, like I've said, is going to be your best bet in terms of saving money. We have recently created a budgeting scheme, I guess, for ourselves. We kind of had to because we didn't arrive with loads of money, and we knew we were obviously going to have to put deposits down for flats and pay rent for things and pay for food. And so being really strict with yourself for those first few months or weeks, depending on how much you have, can really benefit you and really help you save money. We just created a spreadsheet where we've got all our fixed expenses, you've got your income, so you can see how that's going to be spread out, and it just helps us kind of see in front of us what we're spending most of our money on and how we can kind of cut back if needed. It's definitely helped in these last few months. If you're coming and you're worried about budget, honestly, creating a spreadsheet for yourself or just a little document, something for you where you understand it and you can see where all of your expenses are going to go. Otherwise, you'll just be spending and your money will be going, who knows, and suddenly it could come to rent day and you haven't got the rent and you don't know what to do. I definitely recommend just being a bit stricter with yourself. People say that you will save using transport, but I have to say that I don't think transport is ever going to be the cheapest option. I mean, obviously it will be the cheapest if you're doing a long distance, but for me, I prefer walking, and I found that it has saved me a lot more money. For example, our walk into the centre of Melbourne is maybe 40-minute walk at most, and I would much prefer to do that when I'm needing to save money rather than pay for the tram. Melbourne does have a $10 cap if you do multiple trips in one day on transport, so you can't go over $10, which is about £5, £5.50. Which is not actually a lot of money. And so if you're going to be traveling around the whole day, yes, transport's going to be your best bet. For me, if I'm not in a rush and I don't need to be anywhere, I would much rather walk, especially after traveling where we spent so much time walking. I feel like I can walk anywhere and I don't need to rely on the transport. I feel very comfortable walking everywhere. And also it's a bit of exercise, so why not? Another tip when you actually arrive at the place you want to live in is making sure that you have multi-currency accounts. I spoke about this a bit last week in the last podcast episode, talking about having your different cards, like your Wise and Revolut and Starling. You wanna be keeping an eye out for those exchange rates and making sure that if you need to transfer money, you're doing it at a prime time. But with this, also making sure that your girl math does not spiral, because I feel like mine has 100% spiraled moving to Melbourne. I obviously love doing this podcast. I love all things cameras and editing and tech and blah, blah. So when I see cameras in the windows for $300, in my head, I'm thinking, well, that's £150. Technically, it's half price. It's obviously not. Don't let your girl math spiral. But as someone from the UK who's come to Australia, we double everything, or if you do it the other way around, halve everything to turn dollar into pound. So for me, it feels like I'm getting it half off when obviously you are not. And that logic is not going to help you in the long run if you want to be budgeting. Now here I have some frequently asked questions, and I saw these on TikTok, on Facebook. I just did some research trying to understand what is the big thing people want to save on and the big thing that people struggle to budget. So the first one is talking about where to find cheap flights. We booked a lot of our flights through Skyscanner or the airline itself that we were flying with. And another trick we did, I think, for our flight from Chile to Melbourne was booking the flight through Skyscanner, and then we booked our checked luggage on the actual airline's website, a lot cheaper. I'd actually booked the flight and the checked luggage on Skyscanner. I think we did it through booking.com, and it was extremely expensive to have the checked luggage. So we took it off and I got my money back, decided to go with the airline itself to buy the checked luggage because it was so much cheaper, so much cheaper. So that is definitely one way that you can try and budget buying an expensive flight or a long haul flight. I will say that Kiwi was one of the best people we booked through, going on Skyscanner and obviously seeing the cheapest flight we could get. And then we would always book through Kiwi because we just found it to be the most reliable, especially when you're in a foreign country and you're going from one foreign country to another. You don't know the system that well. You don't know if the airlines are that good. Booking with Kiwi made us feel a lot more secure. And I say this because there are some airlines that you can book through Skyscanner that might be rated quite low, and I think there obviously is a reason for that. We originally booked our flight from the UK to Mexico on one day last year, and it was all booked. We thought it was fine, but we had no confirmation emails come through. There had been nothing to confirm, and so we were thinking we've been scammed. And it actually ended up that they gave the money back because there was no seats available on that flight. So we ended up having to buy the flight again, and we did it obviously through a different airline this time because we did not want to have the same scenario. So that's something to definitely be cautious about. Don't necessarily pay hundreds of more pounds or dollars, but you just want to be cautious of who you're booking through and make sure that they are well reviewed. And sometimes it is just cheaper to fly around a country. For example, I'm talking about Argentina quite a lot because it's just where we booked a lot of flights. we flew around the entire country. We took one bus in Argentina, but it was a 24-hour bus from the top of Argentina, a place called Salta, all the way to Iguazu Falls, which is kind of burrowed in between Brazil, Paraguay, and obviously Argentina. And we weren't best pleased taking a 24-hour bus. It was horrible. It was quite a long journey. They're not the nicest buses. And also it was extremely expensive, very, very expensive. And we were not prepared to pay that much going around the entire country. So it ended up being cheaper to fly. So definitely using Skyscanner or websites like Skyscanner, maybe even booking.com, just to see what your cheapest options are. I will say it won't always be buses, and flights could just be a lot easier. One thing that a lot of people ask about is whether it's cheaper to rent or buy when you move to a new country. I obviously haven't bought in Australia, so I'm going to answer this to the best of my ability, but in my opinion, it will always be 100% cheaper to rent if you're only coming here for a short term. So maybe 3 years at most or something. But if you know that you're going to settle down somewhere, you know you're not going to go, for example, back to the UK, then you might want to look at options of buying. But I think that really depends on your situation, and you really have to think about the longevity of your trip. Are you building a new life in this new country, or are you just going to be there for a short amount of time? Because I think that will really alter whether you're going to rent somewhere or buy somewhere. And the last question is about travel insurance, the best travel insurance. I think everybody's going to have their own opinion on their travel insurance. I will just tell you the one that we went with. We went with Tesco Bank. It was about £300 for 6 months of cover. And we kind of went for the extreme cover. I don't know if that was because we were naive. I don't know if it's because we were a bit worried about where we were going, but we had the one that included kidnapping, death, everything. I mean, sounds quite extreme actually, but just in case, you never knew. We didn't know what was going to happen. So it was quite expensive, but we chose it because it was actually the cheapest option for what we were looking for. There are other travel insurance companies that do things where you pay it monthly. So if you don't know when you're going to come home, you've kind of just booked your one-way ticket and you don't know when you're coming back, you can use things like Safety Wing, I know was quite a good one. For monthly payments, you just pay them, I think it was $50 US a month, and they cover you for I think everything apart from water sports or kind of sport activities, just in case you get injured. I think you obviously have to pay slightly more for that. But it looked like a really good plan. We obviously just knew when we were flying to Australia, so we didn't need that one. I really hope that I've answered all the questions you have about budgeting and travel. I'm thinking it could be helpful if I post what I spent each month in each different country maybe. Just to give you an idea if anybody's looking to go to Central or South America. But let me know if that's something you'd like, because obviously I can get that information for you. But I really hope that I've made you feel a bit more confident about budgeting when you're traveling or moving abroad. It's such a big step, and once you get into the routine of budgeting, you kind of can't get out of it. And I think it's been really helpful for us moving to a completely new country where we didn't have a lot when we arrived. We've kind of started from the ground zero. We had just our backpacks on our backs and that's it. So I really hope that this episode has helped. And obviously if you have any other questions, just let me know. Just message me, email me, and I will get back to you. I will see you in next week's episode. Bye.